Senator Henry Cabot Lodge wrote in 1889 that, and I quote, "Our relations with foreign nations today fill but a slight place in American politics and excite generally only a languid interest." You know, and isn't that true? Today, look at how much foreign affairs takes up the news cycle, how much involved every politician is in the news of foreign affairs. And Americans seem totally dominated by foreign affairs. But 100 years ago, it was nowhere near that large of a spot in American reasoning, in American thinking. And that was based primarily, as one historian says, that the United States didn't care about foreign policy because it enjoyed free security. It had wide oceans on each side. It had relatively militarily weak neighbors to the north and to the south. And the British Navy protected the North American continent from European aggressors because it was in their interest to do so, because of British possessions. And so Americans weren't that concerned about foreign affairs. But as you can see behind me, the battleship or battle cruiser Olympia, with the advent of modern technology, the world began to shrink. And with that shrinking came American involvement. We talked about last time the spirit of manifest destiny and how the old manifest destinyers became the imperialists of their day. And that was driven especially by business. The desire for Asia to serve as markets was an alluring temptation. The U.S. population was booming. Productivity in industry was at an all-time high. In agriculture was at an all-time high. Every year before 1876, the U.S. suffered an unfavorable balance of trade. Almost every year after 1876, the United States enjoyed a positive balance of trade. In 1865, the foreign trade of the U.S. stood at $404 million. But by the 1890s, it had reached well over $16 billion. Every president, from Ulysses S. Grant to William McKinley, sought ways to expand foreign markets for American business. The rise of U.S. imperialism coincided with the rise of imperialism around the world. Following the loss of its American colonies, Great Britain kind of took a step back from its imperialistic leanings. But beginning in the 1870s and the 1880s, that imperialism was reawakened as Britain again began paying closer attention to its world empire. France found compensation for its defeat by Germany and consolidating its African empire. Germany, the new kids on the block, to borrow a phrase. Germany, born in the 1870s. There had been German principalities, but with the Franco-Prussian War, they coalesced into the modern state of Germany at the behest of Otto von Bismarck. And so the new German Empire began looking for colonies around the globe. Japan, victorious in a war against China in 1895 and victorious in war with Russia in 1905, it began looking elsewhere for colonies and for the resources that those colonies bring. And with Europe having divided up Africa, they now began looking to other places, especially the Orient, especially Asia, as a new target for colonization. And so looking at places for American markets to go and for American markets to expand, Asia, the completion of Columbus's quest, is prime real estate. But to do that, the question then is sought, how do you get there? How do you get there? So let's look today at the early colonies, the early acquisitions of the United States before the Spanish-American War. It would be immediately after the Civil War that Secretary of State William Seward began seeking the purchase of Alaska. He learned that the Russians were interested in selling their American territory of Alaska. At one point, Russian control extended all the way down into California. You can go to California today and see Russian Orthodox churches. That Russian colonization had extended into what is now modern-day Alaska, modern-day British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. But they really didn't have the populace or the resources to follow up these colonization efforts. And Russia was desperate for cash. And when William Henry Seward learned that Russia was interested in selling, he approached his friend, the Russian ambassador to the United States, Edward Stuckel, to see about the possibility of the United States buying Alaska. Now, the United States isn't just interested in Alaska. And to pose that more as a question, why would the United States be interested in it and purchasing Alaska? Well, look at the map. Any route, especially before the days of longer traveling steamships, is going to require stopovers. Seward's purpose isn't necessarily for the landmass that is Alaska. Seward was a nationalist, and emerging from the Civil War, he wants Canada. And he wants Britain to sell the United States Canada, but they had been reluctant to sell. And so by purchasing or seeking the purchase of Alaska, Seward is trying to sandwich Canada, especially British Columbia, between U.S. possessions and force Britain to the bargaining tables. Now, looking at the map, you can see how following the British Columbian coastline up to Alaska and then the Aleutian Islands across. For any of you who've played the board game Risk, you know that dotted line at the edge of the map that goes from Alaska to Kamchatka. It's easy to make that jump from the Aleutian Islands over to Kamchatka or to Japan, and then from there on into the markets of China. So even without Britain selling British Columbia, which, by the way, they refused to do. Not only do they refuse to sell, they consolidate Canada into its own nation in 1870, allowing Canada a great bit of autonomy within the empire. But Seward approaches Russia for the purchase of Alaska. In March of 1867, the U.S. buys Alaska for $7.2 million. $7.2 million. Critics who failed to see the big picture, the real impact of owning Alaska and what Seward was trying to accomplish with British Columbia, laughed it off. The media laughed at Seward, called it Seward's folly. They called it the Alaskan icebox or Seward's icebox. That it was a waste of money. They weren't laughing within the decade when gold is discovered in the Yukon, and in the first week of the Alaskan gold rush, Alaska more than paid for itself in gold bullion. In fact, Alaska proved to be the greatest land deal, the best land deal the United States has engaged in since the Louisiana Purchase. And so with Alaska, the United States begins to look westward, begins to look and move toward establishing those trade connections with the Orient. William Seward believed that the United States must inevitably exercise commercial domination, and I quote, on the Pacific Ocean and its islands and continents, end quote. And so to do this, he believed the United States must come to dominate the Pacific as well. at least the Central Pacific, if not the Central and South Pacific. So as early as 1872, American shippers began stopping off at the South Pacific island chain of Samoa. You can see in the upper left of the PowerPoint, you can see the 4 islands that make up the primary Samoan chain, and the one in the middle contains the excellent naval base of Pago Pago. And you can see in the lower inset map the centrality, almost the crossroads that is Samoa, that any route to New Zealand or Australia or even potentially the Philippines or China can pass through Samoa. So it offered another route because the northern route is just simply not available for ships to travel all year round. For any of you who have watched the Discovery series, The Deadliest Catch, you know that the northern route fills up with icebergs pretty quick, and you don't want to be caught in the ice flows that come out of the Arctic circles in wintertime. And so you need a more southerly route for ships to travel and to make landfall for the necessities of that length of travel. In the day of sail, you have to have a place for a replenishment of fruits and vegetables on the ship, the acquisition of meat besides the salted pork and fish that you eat, a place to replenish your water supply, fresh water supply, and just simply have shore leave for your crew. And so Samoa will serve that purpose. So as early as 1872, a U.S. naval official negotiated a treaty with the Samoan chiefs granting the United States exclusive use of the port at Pago Pago. Now, the treaty will ultimately fail in the Senate, but it shows American efforts in that direction. And in 1878, the Samoan chief granted the United States a naval base and basing rights in Pago Pago. That treaty passed. And unfortunately for Samoa, the treaty passed because the very next year, 1879, a civil war broke out in Samoa with a pretender to the throne trying to overthrow the king, and then approaching the Germans as potential supporters. The war threatens to become quite devastating. So much so that, as you can see in this picture on the right, the ships of 3 nations, Germany, Britain, and the United States, gathered together. Britain, in fact, interjects its ships between the United States and Germany to prevent the two from going to war. And as Britain's presence begins to wear thin and withdraw, the 2 nations are on the verge of war over Samoa when a late-season hurricane hits and devastates both fleets. And so the German fleet in Samoa and the American fleet in Samoa suffer such damage there can be no war. Battle called off due to storm. Once again in 1887, a civil war erupts in Samoa, and the result was the Great Britain, United States, and Germany sit down to negotiate a settlement on the island of Samoa. The agreement results in the Tripartite Pact, a 3-fold division of the Samoan Islands between the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. And it provided the United States with a southern warm water route to the Orient. But there's still a better route, and that better route ran through the Sandwich Islands, also known as the Hawaiian Islands. And if you can see, as you see on the map, you have the northern route with the 2 stepping stones, Alaska and then the Aleutian Islands and then the route to Kamchatka. Or you can go the southern route to Samoa and then make landfall in in New Guinea or the Philippines and then on to the Orient. Or you can go the middle route. And the circles that are there in the Central Pacific, first are Hawaiian Islands, and then Midway Island, then Wake, then Guam, then the Philippines, and then to the Orient. And so it was seen at Hawaii as the next major landmass near the United States coast. Hawaii was seen as absolutely vital to American interest. And in Hawaii, as in Samoa, American missionaries had been working for years with the native populations, as one historian says, teaching them the virtues of God and of clothing. And so the desire was to build a naval base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. And so the United States is going to enter into negotiations with the Hawaiian kingdom. Hawaii was ruled by a group of monarchs, King Kamehameha being King Kamehameha V being the first to unify the Hawaiian Islands under one central monarch. That had happened in 1863. So Hawaii was ruled by separate chiefs and separate tribal leaders up until 1863 when King Kamehameha consolidates the rule. After his death in 1872, he dies without an heir, and so the kingship passes to King William. His name was Charles Lunalilo, and he will only rule for 1 year, 1873 to 1874, before he too dies, and he dies without an heir. So the kingship then transfers to a new appointment by the Hawaiian Parliament, if you will, chooses a new king. He went by the name of King David, Kalakaua. But King David, so King William, then King David. He would be a monarch from 1874 to 1891. And it would be King David that enters into a reciprocal trade agreement with the United States, negotiating for Hawaiian sugar to be sold in the American market, and the United States Navy gaining basing rights in Pearl Harbor. So the reciprocal 1875 trade agreement, which allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the United States without a tariff. That trade agreement made the Hawaiian government one of the most prosperous. And with that trade agreement, it also brought American sugar producers like Dole to Hawaii to grow sugar cane, which then becomes sugar. With the growth of American missionaries, American businessmen, and American settlers in Hawaii, very quickly the relationship between monarch and people became shaky as the newcomers pressed for a more representative government that they were used to in the United States. King David is going to die in 1891, and with his untimely death, once again he dies heirless, and Queen Liliuokalani comes to power in Hawaii. She's not only a woman, she's not only a native Hawaiian, but she's very angry at the growth of Anglo presence, Anglo power in the Hawaiian Islands. And so she begins a nativist movement to return control of Hawaii, control of resources in Hawaii to native Hawaiians. Queen Liliuokalani's rule is going to be resisted, especially by the newcomers, by the Americans in the group. And so when she ascends the throne in 1891, her reign is further damaged by the passage of the McKinley Tariff in the United States. one of the things that the McKinley Tariff did was remove Hawaii from the protected list of sugar importers. Now, put that in geopolitical terms. As long as Hawaii is independent, it's treated as a foreign nation. But if Hawaii becomes an American territory, then its sugar is treated as domestic sugar. So sugar producers in Hawaii want a closer association with the United States. They also don't like being in a monarchy. They also don't like the nativist reforms of Queen Liliuokalani. So you add all that together and it leads to a revolution. And so an uprising against Queen Liliuokalani's rule, especially because economic times were extremely hard, beginning in 1893. The revolution begins in early 1893. And troops from the USS Boston and the U.S. Embassy support the uprising. You see a picture of the USS Boston up top. It's one of those hybrid ships. It's part sail and part steamship because the engines aren't always that reliable, or to save coal, they will use sail a lot of the time, and then when they need to really get somewhere fast, they start operating the steam engines and use the coal. Well, they use the Marines on board the Boston, supplemented by the U.S. Embassy, to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and bring about local control under Americans who had moved into Hawaii. To quote the American ambassador to Hawaii, he said, and I quote, "The Hawaiian pear," i.e. pineapple, "the Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it." End quote. All right, the timeline here is important. 1892 in the United States is an election year. November of 1892 was an important election, as we've already seen. Grover Cleveland versus Benjamin Harrison. Harrison was the sitting president. Harrison is pro-expansion. He is pro-business. He wants Hawaii to be part of the American fold. So when the revolution breaks out, Benjamin Harrison is very quick to jump on the opportunity. So early 1893, now remember, the election is in November of 1892. Benjamin Harrison loses the election. Grover Cleveland is going to return as the new president. He will take office in March of 1893. So you have this window of opportunity from November of 1892 to March of 1893 that Benjamin Harrison supports this revolution and then rushes a treaty of annexation into the U.S. Senate. With only a few weeks before the treaty was to be voted on, Grover Cleveland comes into office, and believing that the treaty was illegally pursued, he didn't like the use of U.S. troops to overthrow a foreign government. He didn't agree with the treaty. He is an anti-imperialist. He's against expansion. And so Grover Cleveland withdraws the treaty from consideration. The question is, does he restore Queen Liliuokalani to the throne or not? Well, the Americans in Hawaii decide for him. This is now their home country, and they're not about to see Queen Liliuokalani restored. So they seize control of the government, and they declare that Hawaii is a republic. And so the Republic of Hawaii will write a constitution. And on July 4th, 1894, they officially proclaim the Republic of Hawaii. One of the constitutional provisions of that Constitution said that when the United States was ready, they were free to annex Hawaii. And so Hawaii is going to have to wait for 4 years until the Spanish-American War. And during the Spanish-American War, there we go, Hawaii will be annexed. President McKinley, using Hawaii as political leverage, he would argue that the American troops in the Philippines needed a closer supply base than San Francisco, and that Hawaii was the prime location. Seconding that argument is that if the United States didn't control Hawaii and some other foreign country did, it would cut off American access to Asia. That if the Germans, say, took over Hawaii, then German cruisers could intercept all American traffic headed for Asia, and that was unacceptable. And so the United States took the only route that McKinley said was logical, and that is the annexation of Hawaii. They tried for July 4th, but instead on July 7th, 1898, William McKinley would convince the Senate and enough senators would support the treaty. Hawaii became a territory. Now, it's only a territory. That's the first step in the process of becoming a state. And Hawaii is going to linger as a territory until the 1940s, being the last state to join the Union. As you can see from the map, the United States is accomplishing step by step exactly what Mahan had said in The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The United States, and we're going to look at next time, we're going to look at the development of the powerful Navy under the aegises of Theodore Roosevelt, even President McKinley and President Cleveland at the time. The United States in the 1890s and early 1900s will build a superior Navy that comes to dominate both the Pacific and the Caribbean. But following that first step, a powerful Navy, they're then engaging in that next step, the use of a merchant fleet engaged in the third step, foreign commerce. And then the fourth and fifth, you need colonies and you need naval bases. And you can see the stepping stones across the Pacific. The United States has a picket line, a line of defense far from its coast that serve as stations for coaling, for refueling, rewatering to get to Asia. And so the whole purpose here is to get into the markets of Asia, and that's being accomplished. It's going to leave until the Spanish-American War, the acquisition, step 6 and step 7 of Alfred Thayer Mahan's plan, which was control of the Caribbean and an Isthmian canal. So we've actually accomplished that 8th point, controlling the South Pacific. We've done that. Think about how World War II ultimately will be different if American imperialism had gone different. Now, one school of thought says there wouldn't have been a World War II with the United States involved if we hadn't been an imperialist power. That is an ostrich-like philosophy. The United States was going to become a world power. It was a matter of when. So then think of how it would be different if the United States had not acquired those territories. Instead of fighting over Midway Island or the Hawaiian Islands, we would have been fighting on San Francisco or Portland or San Diego or Los Angeles beaches. So substantially in power projection, the acquisition of these colonies has given the United States a more sturdy defense. And so next time we will look at the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of the rest of the American Empire.